Testing the special relationship, the UK's ambassador to the United States resigns in a public row over leaked memos. As Britain prepares for a new Prime Minister and to leave the European Union, how will this affect ties with its closest ally? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Now, what started as a leak of secret diplomatic memos to a British tabloid newspaper has led to the resignation of a top ambassador and to questions about the UK's position in the world. Kim Darroch felt compelled to quit as Britain's man in Washington after a row that swept across the Atlantic. The diplomat had described Donald Trump and his administration as insecure, inept and dysfunctional in his reports back to London. When the contents of those top-secret files became public, the president responded with a barrage of angry tweets. The ambassador was abruptly disinvited from a White House dinner for the Qatari emir. President Trump insulted Darroch personally and announced that he could not work with him. All of this on Twitter. To add to the mix, Boris Johnson, Britain's likely next Prime Minister, refused to publicly support the ambassador. Johnson's critics are angry at how events unfolded.
We really should stand with our own. We send people around the world, we expect them to do a particular job, we don't throw them under a bus. And just because President Trump has thrown a tantrum, it does not mean that we don't stand with him. You know, when you're faced with a bully, you stand up to him, and frankly, that is the sort of thing that Boris Johnson really ought to be doing, you know, when it comes to this president. And frankly, I don't think this bodes well for the sort of Prime Minister that we're likely to get.
Right, let's introduce our guests now. In London, we have Crispin Blunt, a Conservative member of the British Parliament. In Jacksonville, Florida, we have Nancy Soderberg, former Deputy National Security Advisor at the White House. And also in London, we have Matthew Parris, a columnist for the Times newspaper and a former Conservative MP, and clerk for Margaret Thatcher at the Foreign Office. All of you so very well placed then to discuss today's issue. Can I start with you, though, Crispin? You are at a cricket match in London. We're not usually allowed to see you in your sports kit. However, what would you say are the main issues that have arisen as a result of this incident?
Well, people are piling in to criticise Boris Johnson without really appreciating the fact that he is going to be the next Prime Minister. He's the odds-on favourite to win the Conservative leadership election. He has a terrific relationship with Donald Trump in the view of Donald Trump. And, of course, that's at stake if he engaged in what I might describe as a conventional way with this issue. So he's chosen to say nothing in these circumstances. And I think that's probably, for him, the correct response at this moment.
Right, but sorry, Crispin.
It should be taken as axiomatic that there is, of course, support for British diplomats around the world. Absolutely.
Let me put it to you then. A lot of the criticism then that has been pouring out against Boris Johnson and saying that he has no loyalty to anyone and that he was prepared to throw this senior diplomat, a valuable public servant, under the bus.
But that's, of course, nonsense. And it's entirely opportunistic response from people who are campaigning against him on behalf of Jeremy Hunt for the leadership. Alan Duncan used that expression, a kind of classic, colourful Alan Duncan use of language. But the truth is he hasn't said anything apart from his regard for Kim Darroch once he had resigned. And everyone appears to be cheerfully ignoring the fact that Boris is going to be the Prime Minister on the 24th of July, and he brings to the table an immense asset for the United Kingdom in terms of the personal relationship with Donald Trump. The two things that have brought this issue out is the leak, which, of course, is now under subject to investigation, should never have happened, profoundly damaging, very difficult to see who benefits from this. And, of course, the sensitivity of Donald Trump and the extraordinary way in which he chooses to communicate. And Donald Trump hasn't done himself any favours by the way he's responded to this. And he's an issue to manage for all the people around him in the White House. as well as other countries who've got to do business with him.
Right,
And you've got
okay.
to try and find the best way to manage this relationship.
All right, let's go to you, Matthew, also in London. You're shaking your head. I presume, therefore, you don't completely agree with Crispin. I mean, there are many who are suggesting that this whole incident is bringing into question the issue of sovereignty, of Britain's independence from its bigger ally in this so-called special relationship.
Well, it does. I can't believe I'm hearing Crispin Blunt saying these things. No British Foreign Secretary that I can imagine before this former Foreign Secretary would have done anything but stand stalwartly behind Sir Kim Darroch. You absolutely cannot allow other countries to say who they will and who they won't have as their ambassador. This has been an act of appalling, insolent rudeness by the President of the United States. It's very insulting to the United Kingdom. And all the pro-Brexit people, including Boris Johnson, are always talking about how we're going to get away from servitude and vassalage from the European Union. And then we go poodling to the United States just because Boris Johnson thinks, and I doubt whether he's right, that he has a special relationship with the president. It's outrageous, absolutely outrageous.
But, Matthew, there are those who've pointed out, like Crispin, that Britain, post-Brexit, is going to be deeply in need of friends, and that, quite frankly, whoever is to lead the United Kingdom, most likely Boris Johnson, that they need to be prepared to make sure that those alliances are firm no matter what.
Well, it is certainly true that Brexit is going to put us at the mercy of what friends we have left in the world, and that will, to some extent, include the Americans. But if we are to proceed on the basis of a good, deep, equal friendship with the United States, what we absolutely do not do is allow an erratic president to chuck out our own ambassador. It isn't the kind of thing that liberal democratic countries who are allies do to each other.
Right. Coming to you now, Nancy, in Jacksonville, Florida. This so-called special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom has never been one of equals, has it? Has that relationship, do you think, been damaged by what effectively many say is the sacking of a top British diplomat by the tweets of the US president?
The special relationship has gone through bumps in the past and will in the future, but remains a rock solid. We need the UK needs us, and I don't see this changing that one iota. What's unusual about this is that the President of the United States entered the fray. If you remember, with WikiLeaks, we had ambassadors who had to resign. Our ambassador in Mexico had to resign. Our ambassador in Libya had to resign. But what's unusual about this is the president escalated it to his Twitter account and immediately brought it to the fray where the ambassador, Sir Kim, had no choice but to resign. Now, Boris pushed him over the edge, but it was inevitable that he would resign. Normally, what would have happened is a State Department sort of quietly saying, when Boris Johnson comes to power, maybe he could have a new ambassador, and then Sir Kim would be appointed to a new post. Now, Boris Johnson can make it up to Sir Kim by appointing him to something important when he takes over, presumably at the end of this month. But there is no more important diplomatic post than the ambassador to the United States. Having worked there myself, the most coveted invitation in Washington outside a state dinner at the White House is dinner at the ambassador's residence. We've all played tennis there. We have breakfast there, lunch, and it's a key cog in the wheel of diplomacy in Washington. And once the ambassador loses confidence of the White House, and particularly with this White House, because the State Department and the rest of the government doesn't speak with authority, only President Trump does. And so you have to have that inner White House circle. The minute President Trump upped it, he had to have rotated out. We all thought it would happen a little bit more gracefully and a little bit longer, but that's the world of President Trump. It changes everything.
Right, and Crispin, coming back to you, let me quote Peter Ricketts, the former head of the Foreign Service, of course, who called this an act of political sabotage. And he asked the question, what does this say about the state of our country? I'll put it to you again, that the whole issue of Britain's sovereignty and of its status in that relationship with the United States has now been thrown into disarray as a consequence of this.
let's not overstate this. There are leaks. We've had WikiLeaks in the past. This is a particularly toxic leak. It shouldn't have happened. Very difficult to see who benefits from this. So that's one issue. And then that combines with this very unusual, certainly emotionally erratic, insecure president who communicates in this quite extraordinary, undisciplined way. And it's those two things that have come together here to create the circumstance. And Sir Kim Darroch took the decision that, given what President Trump had said about him, that him staying on for another 5 months as the ambassador with the formal support of the British government probably wasn't going to do anybody any favours. And I think he took the correct decision in the wider British interest. And I salute him for it.
OK, but Crispin...
He's been a magnificent career public servant. And no one can blame him.
But that's the very point, isn't it, Crispin?
That many... And for everyone then to pile in on, but for everyone then to well, hang on a minute. For everyone then to pile in on Boris Johnson because he's in the middle of a leadership election, well, I think he wisely simply said. Remember, he said nothing. He didn't endorse President Trump's view. He didn't then immediately invest heavily in Sir Kim Darroch, who was then in difficulty with the president. He has already established, in Trump's word, a very good relationship with the next president of with the president of the United States as the next prime minister of the United Kingdom, and he just, I think, rather wisely chose in these circumstances not to very publicly engage.
Right.
I think he made the right choice.
No, but
other people who have other reasons and other axes to grind think he made the wrong choice.
Let our other two guests come in. I know that both of you want to say. Nancy, first to you, then to Matthew. Nancy, what did you have to say?
By not saying anything, he clearly was not endorsing one of Britain's finest diplomats. And I think it's important that's why you have the ruckus. And I think that's a fair criticism. But the bigger issue here is that the special relationship is going to be just fine. And what happened is that Sir Kim said what everyone in Washington is saying. Talking to all the other diplomats in Washington, they've all written back exactly the same thing. So the bigger question is, does this hamper how a diplomat can do his job? He has to be able to give unvarnished assessments. No one's questioning the assessment, by the way. And the fact that it's now leaked, it's important to find out who leaked it, why, and make sure that we can stem that hemorrhage, because no diplomat can do their job if they're at risk of this. And every other ambassador in Washington, perhaps with the exception of the Iranians and the Chinese, are saying exactly the same thing, maybe not the Saudis. And this is a fine diplomat, former national security advisor, doing his job. And I really hope that the next PM will find a good job for him going on, which is what he deserves. This is unfair to him.
And Matthew, is this merely the latest in a long series of rather uncomfortable moments under the Trump presidency with the government of the United Kingdom? He's blown hot and cold, it would appear, with regard to Theresa May and her handling of the Brexit process, for instance.
Yes, he has, but he'll always blow hot and cold. That's the president. Indeed, Boris blows hot and cold. Boris has been extremely insulting about President Trump, but quite a long time ago. What would worry me, I take Nancy's point that this could have been, should have been quietly done, and just without too much fuss, in all the fuss that there would be over the coming in of a new prime minister, we could have had a new ambassador in Washington. But what would that ambassador have gone to Washington thinking? Thinking that unless he displays almost craven admiration for the President of the United States, he's going to incur this president's displeasure and go in the same way as his predecessor has. Ambassadors have to feel that they are free privately, and this was done privately, to give governments the unvarnished truth. And this is an issue of principle on which, as I say, any foreign secretary, I think, would have stood up for Sir Kim, and Boris didn't. Right.
And coming back to you then, Crispin, this does pose serious questions then about Britain of the future under a Boris Johnson premiership, and as to how he's going to conduct his relationship, how he's going to manage President Trump. You've already suggested that they get on rather well. President Trump has intervened, hasn't he, in the entire debate, clearly preferring Boris Johnson as a candidate to lead the country. But it's going to be a tricky relationship, isn't it, for him to manage?
Well, any relationship with Donald Trump is a tricky relationship for whoever's managing it, because he does blow hot and cold over relationships, however warm they will happen to be at the time. You never know when they might turn, as indeed Theresa May has found out as she's leaving office. You know, he's then been extremely rude about her conduct of the Brexit negotiations, a criticism I would share, I might add, but not very politic for the President of the United States to say it. However, we have a very impolitic President of the United States at the minute. That's the problem. But the principal problem for the United Kingdom is the confidentiality of our communications. It's the leak from those communications that is the issue here for us. That's the practical problem we face. We've got to find out who leaked this and why, and how it was allowed to get into the public domain, because we will not get candid reporting from our posts overseas if they're remotely interesting, or even simply repeat, as this did, what was entirely a common understanding of the management of the Trump administration in a diplomatic telegram. If that is then going to be spread over the front pages of the newspapers in the way that this was, that's the problem. And actually, Boris Johnson is not really the issue here. The issue here is a very unconventional and impolitic president and an absolutely grotesque leak of confidential information.
Right. And Nancy, how is this reverberating in the United States, both within Washington circles and beyond?
Well, first of all, just let me add one point about Boris Johnson, assuming he is going to be the next prime minister. I think he's got a huge challenge in managing President Trump. I do think they have a good relationship right now, and he can use that until he doesn't. And President Trump has no loyalty, and the minute he has an issue with Boris, he will turn on him equally quickly. So he has to kind of walk on eggshells. The ambassador will follow Boris Johnson's lead, the new one. But in Washington, I think no one's worried about the special relationship. Most of us who've been at the senior levels in Washington have spent a lot of time at the UK ambassador's residence. That will continue. I think what they're more concerned about is what does this do to chill the ability to have frank conversations in Washington. I think you'll have less in writing, more on secure lines going back, and it will chill the ability of diplomats across Washington. This probably will not be the last leak. It's important to find out who did it. But again, the special relationship is strong and vibrant, and this president is incredibly difficult to manage. And the diplomatic corps will continue, has written about that, and will continue to write about that, perhaps in more secure communications. But I do not envy Boris Johnson's trying to manage the relationship with this very volatile president. He's on the in now, but my prediction is that probably won't last.
And Matthew, I suppose one of the most scrutinised first actions of Boris Johnson, presuming he does become the next Prime Minister of the UK, will be who he chooses to appoint to this very important position as Britain's ambassador to Washington. He will be scrutinised, won't he, for every kind of nuance in terms of the appointment?
Oh, yes, yes. Unless I've missed something in the last hour or two, then we shouldn't rule out the possibility that the present Prime Minister, Theresa May, in her dying days, so to speak, will herself appoint a new ambassador. She could do that. David Cameron appointed our ambassador to France in the last days of his prime ministership. But if it is Boris, well, everybody knows that Nigel Farage would actually like to be ambassador to the United States, however much he professes that he wouldn't. I do hope Boris wouldn't do anything as stupid as that. I just threw in one thought. I heard the head of the Foreign Office tell members of Parliament that this leak couldn't have come from the Americans because he said we do not spy on each other. I certainly hope that's not true. I would be very surprised if the Americans had no capability to intercept British telegram traffic. And Donald Trump himself has an interest in the upsetting, overthrowing and ousting of this ambassador.
Right, and Crispin, coming back to you with that point then, because whoever was behind this leak must have had some sort of political motive, a political game plan. What sort of game plan do you think it was? It was, I mean, these were cables that were from 2017, so quite old, and then they were released to a well-known newspaper supporting the Brexit process.
Well, that's of course the most important question, and one that is most difficult to answer, because this ambassador only had 5 months left to serve. So why would, if it was the Americans who were the source of this, or some people close to Donald Trump, why on earth would they do it? To take all that risk for such little reward in terms of getting a new appointment in the circumstances that have happened. So that doesn't make too much sense. And that's the question everyone's trying to work out, is who gains by this? It's really a disaster for all concerned.
I think it's highly
and it's not
unlikely.
least a serious handicap now to candour in future reporting back.
Right, Nancy?
Yeah, it's highly unlikely this came from the United States. We don't spy on each other. That's been a long-standing relationship issue, and I'm not in the government right now, but I would be shocked if that had changed. And I think this is clearly somewhere within the UK system, but trying to decide who leaked things is a parlor game in Washington that always fails until there's a real investigation. It's never who you really think it is. And we had the leak in Valerie Plame's CIA identity, and everyone thought it was someone in the White House. Turns out it was Rich Armitage in the State Department. And I think we'll be surprised in the end of who in the UK system did this. It could have been another government as well. There are other governments certainly do spy on the UK, but not the US. So we will certainly find out, I believe, who was the leaker here. And that will hopefully be the end of it. They'll be able to stem that leak and plug it, but it will provide a chill throughout the diplomatic corps. There isn't a diplomat in Washington right now that isn't saying, all right, who could possibly leak our communications? Maybe I shouldn't put that in writing. I'll just pick up the line on the secure phone, which tend to be actually fairly secure. And I think it will chill the work of Washington. But the bigger challenge here, I think, isn't the leak so much as what is the UK's role in the post-Brexit world? Will they actually have Brexit? Now, President Trump has told Theresa May, and has been tweeting about it, that he told Theresa May how to exit and get a deal for the Brexit. He didn't listen to her. That's her problem. He's going to give the same advice to Boris Johnson. Now, it is not a given that Boris Johnson will bring about an effective exit from Brexit. The minute he doesn't do that, and it's clear that he's failed on that, Trump will have the same relationship with him. They're ideologically aligned right now. They even got the same wild hair, the same brash personality. But if Boris doesn't deliver on Brexit, which President Trump fully supports, he's going to lose his confidence. And where's his plan? How is it going to be different than Theresa May's? To me, that's the question before the British people. And frankly, it's of deep concern to the United States. Will they have a do-over referendum?
Right,
absolutely.
We're running out of time.
How Boris handles that is the key question.
Sorry to jump in, Nancy, but we are running out of time. I'd like to give the final word to Matthew, because, of course, the British public generally will have no say in who becomes the next Prime Minister of the UK. But we're getting an idea, are we, of what a Boris Johnson premiership will look like. Give us your ideas, your take on that within 40 seconds, if you can, Matthew.
Yes, I think he'll be buffeted in all directions. I don't think he'll be brave. I don't think he'll have a very clear idea where he wants to go or what he wants to do. And the last person to speak to him will likely be the most powerful person in the United Kingdom. If he has buckled so quickly on this, what else could he not buckle on?
Right, OK, thank you all very much indeed. Crispin Blunt in his cricket gear, talking to us from London, Nancy Soderberg talking to us from Jacksonville, Florida, and Matthew Parris also talking to us from London. Thank you all very much indeed for a really interesting conversation. And as ever, thank you for watching. You can see the programme again anytime you like by going to the website, aljazeera.com. Should you want more discussion, you can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And there's always the Twitter sphere, as you well know. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. I'm @Martine Dennis. From me and the whole team here in Doha, it's bye for now.